We're back, and you are listening to Soul Talk. And this morning we have Christopher Penczak on our recorded show here. I'm very excited to have him on the show, as I was stating before. I met him, like I said, at Angel Heart Gifts about 2 years ago and heard a lecture that he gave, and he is just a wonderful energy and a wonderful person, and I'm very excited to have him on our show here this morning. So, Christopher, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing, Jeremy?
I'm very, very, very good. It's kind of warm down here. It's warming up from the cold we had over the winter, so we're kind of excited about that. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is I about 4 years ago read The Magic of Reiki, and I was in the middle of writing a book of myself, and I was blocked on the book, and I read your book. And I was like, wow, he has a very eloquent way of putting things. And then I kind of just did a lot of research on you and kind of read your story that you were, I might get some of this wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong, that you went to school for music, and then you were raised not in the faith you're in now, and then you had a journey getting to where you're at. And so what this show is about is talking about our journey and how we get where we're at and how we feel self-realized and just really heal ourselves. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your journey.
Sure. Well, that's absolutely right for the broad strokes of things. I was raised Catholic and kind of came from an old immigrant Catholic family up in the Northeast. There's my family's only been here for a couple generations, half Italian, half Polish, but definitely kept their kind of old world connections, and we're very kind of European Catholic and very faithful and really focused on a lot of the culture. We go to the little holiday feasts and things that would be held in street fairs and things. So in many ways, the religion that I was raised in also had a big cultural component to it. But my parents ended up moving to New Hampshire, just a little further away from where they were raised in Massachusetts, and you kind of settled into suburban lifestyle, but they sent me to Catholic school, and so I still had some of those connections. But as I grew up, kind of coming to the realization as a gay man growing up in the Catholic faith that it wasn't really the right place for me. I didn't really feel welcomed. I didn't really understand the theology and the rules and the mores against who I was or who I felt I was becoming. And so that started me out on a quest. So I was raised in 12 years of Catholic school. In the last 4 years were an all-boys high school. And really kind of asking questions and finding out I was pissing off all the teachers for asking these questions or not believing blindly. I can remember very clearly at CCD for confirmation in the Catholic faith, where you have to kind of affirm yourself as an adult in the faith, and having this big argument with the teachers saying, well, part of the ritual is to renounce the devil. And I said, well, I can't renounce the devil. And she got very upset. And I was just like, well, I can't renounce the devil because I don't believe in the devil. I think people make their own mistakes and their own choices, and I think it's kind of silly to blame something that we have no evidence of. And that's when I knew it was at the end. That's when I knew that they wouldn't be the right place for me. And so I started to search for other religions and looked into a lot of Eastern lore, a lot of Taoist stuff, a lot of Hindu and Buddhist stuff. But at New Hampshire at the time, the closest you could get to a religious experience in the Eastern lore was yoga at your gym. So I didn't necessarily have an experience of it, but I thought they were nice ideas. And then a friend of mine, who was a family friend for years, she was my art teacher, she was my first boss. She ended up introducing me to the concepts of witchcraft, and she waited till I was 18 to even tell me that she was a witch, because in her day and age, it wasn't a family religion, it wasn't something you raised kids in, it was something that was pretty private. And once she revealed that to me, I thought she was crazy. I thought she had really, kind of crossed the line of mental clarity, because it just really felt like, who in this day and age thinks that they're a witch? Who in this day and age thinks that they're psychic or can cast spells or any of that? It was way before it really entered popular consciousness. It's before there was TV shows and movies or even talk shows that talked about it.
Right.
And but she was patient with me and really showed me a lot of information. And the more she taught me the philosophies of it, the more I was like, oh, well, this is actually a lot like these other things I'm studying, and this makes a certain amount of sense to me. But she also gave me the opportunity to experience it directly. So I got to go to a moon ritual with her that was really phenomenal, not just religiously moving. In some ways I couldn't necessarily feel the energy the way that other people talk about it today. But, she called down to the moon, the clouds parted, and there was the moon. And then we got an opportunity to do spells, and I did a healing spell for somebody that was remarkable. That gave me enough thought to think that something's going on here, this might be real. and she trained me a little bit in meditation and psychic development, and then she brought me to her teacher, who was a woman named Lori Cabot. Lori Cabot's a pretty famous witch up in our area, in the New England area, but had done a lot of work nationally in the 80s, particularly for environmental and women's rights and pagan rights. And she taught me, and so I studied under her for a while, and just kind of went off on my own, and I was still pursuing music at the time, and my music career eventually hit a wall, and I really felt called, quite literally, by the goddess to start teaching and to start writing, and I got laid off from my job in the music industry. I was working in Boston at a studio and a record label, and they really got to this point where everything was going really terribly. I get laid off, and I go to meditate and ask, well, what do I do? How do I find a job? What should I do? And I just got the answer, you need to teach more. So from that point, I just started teaching classes and wrote my first 2 books while I was on unemployment, and things really blossomed.
It sounds like we have a very interesting and similar story in a lot of ways, because that's kind of like the way mine went. But that's actually really cool. And so when you wrote the first book, I think it was Gay Witchcraft. Was that the first one?
Actually, the very first one was City Magic. I went from practicing with a magical group in New Hampshire to working in Boston, and so I had to adapt a lot of my techniques for nature-based religion to an urban environment. And so I was practicing a lot of things on my lunch breaks and kind of wandering the city because I didn't have the traditional group. And so I kind of gathered all that lore together and really created, one of the first books on urban magic and urban spirituality and how to really look at the energies of the city as something alive and not just something that you despite that the city is there, but to really embrace the nature of the city and the spirits of the different neighborhoods and to really kind of look at cities as power vortexes, and that's why people are attracted to settle in that area. There's a reason why people go to them. So that was the very first book.
Oh, very cool. Very, very cool. And so you, one of the things I really loved about the magic of Reiki is how you brought magic and Reiki together. And it was a very spiritual experience for me and made me realize how everything, to me, what I got out of it is, of course, the teaching, but I also came out of it and I started looking at the correlation between many, many things and how we're so divided among spirituality and religion. And I thought to myself, at the very core of everything is magical, and everything is a miracle, and everything is a blessing. And it was almost like you had that same feeling, but I could be speaking out of turn when you wrote that book, and that's just the feeling I got off of it. But
Absolutely.
And so what got you to that point when because I know you were doing healings for your mom, and then you got introduced to Reiki, if I remember right in the book. It's been a few years since I read it, but.
Yep, nope, that's absolutely right. In fact, my mom had studied witchcraft with me, and kind of the hoot of the whole thing is that she thought I was joining a cult once I got serious about witchcraft. But she didn't tell me that because she knew I was pretty, rebellious in my own way and pretty willful. And if she said, "Oh no, you can't practice this," I was 18 in college at the time when I got involved. That, I would disobey her. So she was like, "Oh, I'm really interested in this. Tell me more." So I really kind of educated her. And then when I started studying with Lori, she took classes with me. I found out years later that she took it just because she thought this was some type of cult that I was joining, and she wanted to be there if they said something bad, or she wanted to be able to pull me out if it got dangerous or something. But come to find out, after the second degree of training, she decided that she wanted to be a witch, and she gave up Catholicism to do it. So she had experienced some health problems, and still is going through some pretty major health problems at the moment. But at the time, magic had worked pretty well for her for a lot of things, but there were some issues that weren't being cleared up. We had a friend who was interested, who also had some health problems, and she was interested in learning Reiki. And it was a bit further away than where my mother was comfortable for traveling, but it wasn't too far from this friend's house. So I stayed the night at this friend's house, and we went to this weekend training together just to see what it was about. And I really did it with the intention of maybe this is a modality that will help my mom and help her with some of her pain issues.
Right.
The funny thing, even in that class, it was a very strict traditional Reiki class, and Reiki, just like any tradition or modality or even with teachers, can come in a lot of different flavors and find the one that vibes right with you.
Of course.
But this particular class was taught in the Usui tradition, and it was a very strict Japanese Usui tradition with nothing New Age added to it or no other philosophies added to it, and it was very secretive and very long and very not heavy on the information. They really, they kind of parse the information out as you go through the degrees. So I was asking lots of questions as usual and not getting a lot of answers. And I found that the majority of the people at that class were very mainstream. So in many ways, the teachers just had a challenge trying to explain energy that wasn't electricity or light. The idea of light force was a big deal for them, just trying to explain the concept. And many of the people there, when we had to go around and explain our back rooms, I would say, why I was there and what I'd studied before, and they all looked at me like I had three heads because I was involved in magic and witchcraft. And, some of them were fascinated, and some of them were coming from more of a mainstream religious view and were really repulsed by it, and I felt a little shunned, me and my friend. But I kind of came out of it with an understanding of Reiki enough to apply it to my mom and really have some interesting experiences with it. But I think it was really the magic and the witchcraft background. The type of witchcraft I studied could be considered to be hermetic. And hermetic relates to the teachings of Hermes.
Can I just stop you right there? So we're going to go into the commercial break, and then we'll come back and finish that. Okay, so we're back with Christopher Penczak, and he was just explaining his journey with Reiki and the correlation the spiritual journey he had with learning Reiki and the correlation with magic. And he was just talking about hermetics, I believe. And
your original thought was about how everything was a blessing, how everything is connected, and everything's a miracle, everything is magical, and I highly agree with that. And one of the things that brought me through was that Reiki experience, but to be able to see and understand Reiki, part of the witchcraft I studied was called hermetic witchcraft. And hermetic is really a broad term. It goes back to a philosopher who could be mythic called Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes Thrice Great. And it also relates to the god Hermes from Greek mythology as a god of magic and travel and information. And there's a series of philosophies and teachings that are part of the Hermeticum. And different magical traditions have adopted from it. But the great thing about the Hermetics, what this relates to my Reiki experience, is that it really is a view and a philosophy of magic and how the universe works and how spiritual entities and spiritual forces all work together. And I found a lot of people who have a Hermetic view have almost a kind of scientific view to mysticism. So they're always looking for the common threads. They're always looking for what's the pattern behind the religious and artistic experience. They're always kind of making maps creatively to try to understand how things are connected. I really think of Hermetics as one of the expressions of what people call the perennial philosophy, kind of the world wisdom. I think at heart, every mystical, magical, spiritual tradition, when you look at its magical core, is part of this perennial philosophy. I think it transcends cultures and times and people and religions. I think dogmatic religions can sometimes miss it. But even in the most dogmatic religions, there's always a mystical side, and I think that mystical side gets it. Yeah. So for me, witchcraft and magic is an expression of this perennial philosophy. But once you really root yourself in the idea of a perennial philosophy, and that's what the Hermetic part has really brought to me, you start to see what's similar in Reiki, and Reiki coming out of Japanese Buddhism, and looking to greater Buddhism, and looking in the East to the Taoist traditions, and a lot of Hindu aspects get mixed into Reiki with the chakras and that type of information, and you start to look at all these, magical, mystical philosophies and maps of understanding yourself and understanding the universe embedded in all these traditions, and you start to see the similarities and realize, wow, everything does have a connection, and essentially there's a human experience, and each culture and each time period and each land, really puts the human experience to their place in time, but it's still the human experience.
Yeah, and that's that was the correlation I had, and it's one. I think it's one of the hardest things to teach people, that everything is similar, and a lot of people read all the texts, and I'm like, would you have to open yourself up to this and feel it?
Absolutely. Until you experience it, it's hard to know that it's all the same, because it does look radically different. Like if you compare the spiritual levels of consciousness and Kabbalistic magic to Tibetan Buddhism, on the surface they don't look that similar, but when you start to experience these things directly and can kind of read between the lines and look at the patterns, they might draw their lines in different places, but it's the same journey, it's the same pattern.
Right.
A lot of people will say we're all approaching, we're all climbing up the spiritual mountain, but we're all taking different paths. Well, if you can look at different people, so if you can step back and look at different people and different religions' paths, you realize, it is all going to the same place, and it is basically covering the same terrain. But if you're on a different path, it's going to look differently, and you're going to express it differently, but it's heading in that same direction.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing of what's happening in consciousness right now, is that consciousness is awakening, and people are starting to see it, but it's also shaking things up too.
I think one of the challenges we'll have in this new aeon is really creating spiritual traditions for this culture. You know, we're either looking at things from a strict past, like one of the things I'm really concerned about, you know, just from a witchcraft perspective is what are we doing as modern witches? You know, the way we expressed it 4,000 years ago in ancient Greece isn't necessarily appropriate right now, and how do we express it now as modern people with respect to the things we're drawing from and syncretizing them all and making the poetry and the art of it really speak to our people now, you know? Because I think all the things that have come before have been great roadmaps, but I think, you know, none of us are living in, most of the people I know who practice Tibetan Buddhism aren't living in Tibet and aren't rooted in that culture, or most of the people I know who are practicing English witchcraft aren't in England right now. So it's you know, how do we find what's right for us as modern people wherever we're living?
Yeah. Now, you know what's interesting is that I know you and I kind of went back and forth because you have a really busy schedule, and I actually have a really busy schedule to kind of pin down to be able to do this. And it was interesting to me because to me the 11th day of every month this year is pretty significant. And of course today is April 11th, 2011. And so that's pretty significant to me. What do you feel about us coming into this? You know, you mentioned we're not talking about the new era. What do you feel this new era is coming in? I mean, there's obviously we're shaking things up here, this in 2011. But
one of the ways that I really like looking at symbol systems to understand where we've been, where we're going. And I'm a big embracer of the idea of the New Age. At heart, I'm really connected to a lot of the philosophies, although I don't practice it specifically. I'm connected to the philosophies of something called Thelema, which was the religion of Aleister Crowley. And he describes the new aeon as the aeon of the child, the aeon of Horus. Or if you look at it in astrology, it's the aeon or the age of Aquarius. And when you look at the shift in astrology between what people call the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius, Pisces is very vertical. It's very much about top-down authority being kind of handed down as a line of succession. And I think it really exemplified the most in like our religious institutions like the Catholic Church. You know, but you even find it in mystical traditions. Like there's a lineage of Sufis, there's a lineage of witches, but it's really kind of a passing of the power from top down. Where Aquarius, we're going to be challenged. The new models are all about lateral relationships. They're all about councils and everybody kind of coming to the table is different but equal. Everybody having something to express, but really circles are the model for it. You know, if every person or every institution is a point within that circle, if you take anyone out, it's going to be a different circle. It's going to be a different shape, different size to it. So it's really kind of looking at this age of consciousness. How do we shift ourselves out of a vertical hierarchy into kind of a horizontal community? For the 11th, the numerology that I work with is more Hermetic, Kabbalistic numerology. And 11 really relates to the number of magic. It's the number of one of the master numbers, any of the double digits. But particularly 11 is considered to be very magical. One of the things that we relate it to in Kabbalah is some people spell magic with the K at the end of it, M-A-G-I-C-K, and Aleister Crowley was the first one to make that popular. And the K is the 11th letter of the alphabet, and so it has this kind of extra magical quality to it. 11 in Kabbalah is also associated with the invisible sphere, the invisible sephira, known as Da'at, which is knowledge, kind of the initiation of the abyss, having to go through magic and seek out knowledge, but at the same time not be seduced by knowledge, to realize that knowledge by itself is an enlightenment. You have to gather that knowledge, but then push through it to really seek out your enlightenment. So it's both a blessing and a curse, that kind of magical knowledge. So I think the years of 11s and all the 11s that are kind of coming out through the month of 2011, it's really a call for magic. I know a lot of people are really drawn to magic in the last coming years, and even more so this year. And so whenever I do anything numerologically with 11, I always try to think about the magic and the sphere of Da'at and the abyss and how to cross the abyss, because it's really, the abyss represents our separation from divinity, and it's really an illusion. But how do we bridge that gap of that seeming illusion? Because we live in this world where we feel like we're separated. So how do we get over that feeling and really live from a place of connection?
You know, and that makes total sense when you think about it, because 11 being mastery, there's a lot of things that could make you feel separated this year. And if you really stay still and grounded, you're going to look at it from an observer standpoint and know that you're really not separated, that it's your own chaos and the own things going on inside of you that's going to cause.
I even think chaos and upheaval of emotions or whatever it may be can be great teachers. You know, sometimes we can stay grounded through them, and sometimes they become triggers. And I think it's sometimes a fallacy to think that just because you're in emotional turmoil or upheaval, that that's a bad thing or an indicator that you're not in greater spiritual awareness, because sometimes those things are very initiatory and they trigger. So, I always urge people, if you're worried about your stock market and money, if you're worried about the planet right now, if you're worried about the government, if you're worried about wars, use those feelings that are coming up for you, because they're all a reflection of something that's also going on inside of us as an initiatory trigger. If you're worried about the wars in the world, what wars are going on within you at the same time? If you're worried about natural disaster, what disasters are going on with you? And using those as mirrors and allegories for the inner experience.
Yeah, perfect. And we're just going to wrap up this segment, and we'll be right back with Christopher Penczak. We were having a conversation about the numerology of the mastery number 11, and more importantly about our inner journey. And we were talking about chaos, and I totally agree that chaos can be a catalyst to be more aware of yourself. And I always say you're standing in the eye of the storm, and the storm's going on around you, but you're very still. And and that's to me chaos and what people would consider to be things that they didn't want to look at are an opportunity for you just to get to understand and be more in tune with what I call my divine self inside. But what you mentioned, you were talking about the inner journey, or just your inner self, and it's interesting. The lecture I saw, you were just coming up. I cannot remember the book. It was 2 years ago. You did a lecture at Angel Heart Gifts, and you were talking about. I think you were talking about the story of Inanna and her descent into the underworld.
Yeah, okay, that was probably for when I was on tour for the Living Temple of Witchcraft, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and we were, I remember I got a lot out of that lecture, because when I started thinking about her descent into the underworld, and she's literally taking, you explained this, she's taking all the material stuff off of her body, and she realizes that her dark side, or like, Jung called our shadow side, is something that she didn't want to look at, she wanted to bury.
Right.
And, I'm looking at, as we're mastering all this energy, we have to understand all aspects of ourselves. And I've actually, I've given you credit in that many lectures I've done at expos and talked about it, because I said you really have to understand this side of yourself and not ignore it. Can you talk a little bit about that story and how you came about, do your research for that book? And
Sure. It's really kind of a classic part of modern witchcraft lore today, although it's not really explicitly taught, in always the same ways that I'm teaching it. Mm-hmm. I'm a big believer, and one of the things that we have sometimes that can be a problem when we have more people who are seeking than we have teachers and groups and systems to kind of set up to help them, is that people really tend to seek out the things that flatter them, the things that are fun. So I found a lot, like in the modern witchcraft movement, which is what I really minister to the most, is a lot of people will focus on the things that are very much of the light. They're very bright, they're very happy, that focuses on the love and the compassion, which is all wonderful, and I think that's definitely very necessary. But most of the mystery traditions, most of the formal schools, most of the formal traditions will have you go through some type of systemized period to descend into the darkness. And I think that's missing for a lot of people who are self-taught and a lot of people who are excited, but really have this kind of one-sided view of what spirituality and to be a spiritual person is. I've even had people and monks. I feel like a big part of my job is to bridge the gap between different traditions, like between the magical communities, and Reiki was a big one. I also did another book that was about the magical traditions and the Ascension community. And in the Ascension community, I had a lot of people that are kind of the broader, more hardcore, New Age folks, look at things and say, wow, you're talking about the dark, this must be evil, are you a black brother? And I'm like, no, this is, kind of standard mystery training stuff. But I think people shy away from that. And I think an important part of it is to be able to see, the parts of us that we repress. When we talk so much about you create your own reality, and, what you think is what you manifest. I think that's very true, but then you look at people who have illness, or people who have injury, or people who have poverty, and you say, were they really wishing that on themselves? How can you believe that? This is very blame-oriented. But there's parts of you that really can create your life that you're not aware of, whether we think of them psychologically as unconscious or whether we think of them magically as the repressed shadow. But there's something going on there that you give away a lot of your power when you deny parts of yourself.
Right.
So part of my own training is we have a 5-degree system, and in the 3rd degree, we do an operation called Distilling the Shadow. We really try to dredge up all the awful emotions and give it form so we can actually communicate with that part of ourselves. And then in the 5th degree, we take something that a lot of traditional Wiccan groups do in the 2nd degree, the Descent of the Goddess. Mm-hmm. A lot of Wiccan groups tend to focus more on the fertility aspects, and the group that I'm involved in and founded focuses more on the death and resurrection. So we focus on the Descent of the Goddess, and basically she goes to the land of the dead, and the story that's most complete is the story of Inanna. Inanna is seeking out her sister in the underworld, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal is this dark, terrible lady of the dead. And as she descends, Inanna has to face these 7 guardians. She faces these 7 guardians. Each one asks for something. Mm-hmm. So she has all her accoutrements of her office as a queen of heaven and earth. So she has to give up her crown, and then she has to give up her necklace. She has to give up the double-strand necklace, and she gives up her breastplate, and she gives up her bracelet and her cords and measuring line, and finally her robe. And she's down naked in the underworld before her sister. And her sister's very mad to see her, and there's lots of interpretations why, but she opens up her baleful eye and slays Inanna, and she's descended to the underworld and dies. And she's set in motion, or she shouldn't come back this way to be rescued, and so her servants undergo this whole process to rescue her. So different parts of herself, basically, are helping resurrect her, and they give her the food of life and the water of life, which is a big part of traditions all across the world, whether it be Wiccan, Christian, or anything else, of sacrament. And through that sacrament of resurrection, she's awoken and now knows the mysteries of her shadow, the mysteries of her sister's realm, and can be resurrected in full power and be aware of both the light and the darkness. Each of the tools she gives up represents a different power, and we can relate them to the 7 chakras, we can relate them to the 7 planets, but each one represents a surrender. So when she surrenders, she comes back from that and can be fully empowered in those areas in ways that just material blessings don't give you.
You know, and that's really interesting, because I think at the end of the story, her grandfather has to send somebody in to save her.
Yes, one of the other gods she talks to that she's related to, she basically tells her servant to go to the other gods, and the only god that really cared about her ends up sending 2 creatures that are considered to be gender neutral, which is kind of interesting. A lot of queer practitioners look at these figures as like the Sumerian story of the first gay and lesbians, the first queer people. They were called the Yeshu Shamir. And they're neither male nor female, and they were created from underneath his fingernails. But they were so small and unseen that they would descend through the 7 gates and not be seen by the guardians. They carried the food of life, they carried the waters of life, and they tricked the darker sister into really playing her part in the role. She was pregnant, or she was in pain, and she's moaning, and the Yeshu Shamir, really empathized with her, and she says, "Oh, my side," and they're like, "Yes, oh, my side," and she's so bewildered as the shadow to have somebody have compassion for her and to have sympathy for her. In the end, she says, "Whatever's in my kingdom I can give you, I'll give you what you want." And they point to Inanna's body. And so they take the body and then resurrect her. But then in the end, Ereshkigal is said to curse Yeshu Shamir, and that they will never be loved or accepted amongst the people in the world above. So it's an interesting little kind of queer spirit myth for some people, too.
I just think it's a pretty cool thing, because she has to really see that her sister, in some ways, is her. Her mirror. And then
I had a good teacher who said one of the great things about any of these myths, when you're applying it to yourself, try to look at each of these characters as different facets of one being, and that one being is you.
Yep, that's what one of my mentors said. She says, "Look to the myths," and I was like, "What do you mean?" At first,
I mean, once you start thinking that way, that makes it make a lot more sense personally.
Right.
I know for me, I studied a Celtic tradition. You look at a lot of the Celtic stories, and you're like, "Oh, what's going on here?" But start to think of them all as aspects of the same person, and it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, that's incredible, and I love that story, because when it was interesting, because I was not going to go to your lecture, and then my friend says, "You have to go," and because my mother was in the hospital, and I grabbed my mother's book from her house, because she follows you a lot, and her and I grew up spiritually together. We switched from Christianity to metaphysics, and but she went into it first. You went into it first, and your mom followed you. She went into it first, and I followed her. And I thought she was crazy. But when I went to your lecture, I saw it, and I got to get you to autograph her book. And of course, I took it to her in the hospital, and it was very healing for her. because she's a Reiki master and a Qigong practitioner and a healer herself, and so it was she actually took that energy and it reminded her that she could heal herself, and she actually had a near-death experience as a result of the heart attack she had. So it was been an awakening for her ever since then. So we're going to wrap up this segment, and we'll be right back. Thank you for listening to Soul Talk. And welcome back. We're talking to Christopher Penczak, and just so you know, his website is ChristopherPenczak.com, and of course it's ChristopherPenczak. His last name is Penczak.com. If you want to know anything about his future events, his classes, his tour dates, or any of his books that are coming out, check him out at his website. And Christopher, we were just talking about the story of Inanna, and honestly, the way I look at that story is that we have to love all aspects of ourselves, and accept it. And it was very shortly after that, well, maybe about a year after that, there was a movie that came out called The Living Matrix. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but was a doctor of osteopathy, and I'm mispronouncing that, I know, but she had a tumor in her brain, and she spent 10 years learning NLP and Reiki and EFT and all this other kind of stuff, and it wasn't going away. And so finally one day she looked in the mirror and she just screamed at herself, and she says, "I hate you," basically. And the tumor responded back to her.
Wow.
And she finally had to accept it. And when she accepted it until it gave her permission to stay, it shrunk.
Wow.
And her oncologist.
Yeah, well, I think that's a huge part. Acceptance is a huge thing. Sometimes it's not what we want, but it's what we accept into our consciousness.
Yep. And then the oncologist.
I know in my own healing work, a lot of people end up coming to the doorstep of the witch either for a miracle or, to prepare to die. And, both actually are kind of a miracle, but, sometimes people walk out and they have that process of acceptance, and the miracle cure happens, and sometimes people, prepare their spirit to journey to the next adventure, and I mean, both are important, both are beautiful, but it's not always what the person, consciously, personal self wants.
Right, they have to let go of the expectations and know that the journey is...
Because both are healing, whether you live or whether you die, both are healing. It's just tough to accept that from a human level.
Yeah, of course, we can always see it. So a little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about your current project that's coming out. Well, it looks like it's done, and it's called The Plant Spirit Familiar.
Yeah, I started my own publishing company with a couple partners to do some more magical grimoire-esque books. And our second release is called The Plant Spirit Familiar, and it just actually came out a couple weeks ago. And I'm very excited to start teaching about it and traveling around for it. It's basically about, as you're familiar, most people are familiar with the idea of having a totem animal. Well, it kind of takes that idea from some witchcraft traditions and some native traditions that you can have a totem plant.
Right.
And it gets from a witchcraft perspective. We often call our animal spirits familiars, and so it looks at the plant spirit as a familiar, an intermediary, a go-between, and how certain plants will be bonded to you and will teach their lessons to you, much like an animal spirit can teach its lessons to you. So it's been really fun to be teaching about that, because it's something that's not often talked about, and people really respond so much to the green world. So while it's a book on plant magic and has formulas and things to it, it's really about the spirits of the plants and how you can commune with them.
And I don't think people appreciate that as much, because and I think it's such an amazing, amazing thing. We don't connect with our animals or our plants or our trees. And my first experience with that was probably about 8 years ago. I was walking through a park, and I literally heard this voice in my head, and it was more of a feeling. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And I looked, and I started talking to the trees walking by, but I felt wisdom coming back to me. And my my dog, I have a Rottweiler, and I remember I got him. He was dumped. He was a stray, and about 6 months old, starved to death. And I remember working with him and training him. And I heard, if you don't love me but aren't strong, you won't. I'll be out of control. And what I realized is he was a great mirror for me. So. And he was mirroring back the strength I needed to find in myself. And I'm not sure what this book. I'm going to be buying this book to read it, but I think we missed that opportunity to really connect with animals and trees and plants and flowers and everything else.
Absolutely. I think nature is a great teacher. Coming from a nature religion foundation, I think that so many of the secrets and the mysteries are encoded, all around us in nature. But we just have to slow down. We have to observe. We have to connect. We have to communicate.
Yeah.
I think the beautiful thing about the plant spirit work is it draws from something called plant spirit medicine, and how you can help heal people just by invoking the energies of the plant, invoking their wisdom. And we have this whole idea that the herbalists found their lore through trial and error, because we come from a society that's very trial and error. But if you talk to any kind of Stone Age tribal level of technology person, they'll say, the plants told them how to use them and what to mix them with and how to mix them and when to pick them. And I found as a spirited herbalist, that's very true for me as well, that the herbs will tell you what their spirit's about, what they can be used for medicinally, what they can be used for magically, and it's all about that relationship. So as you forge that relationship, I teach in this book that there's 3 basic types of plants. There's what we call the balms, and the balms are like the healing plants, so they're the ones who bolster us. There's the banes, and those are the traditionally poisonous plants that you find in witchcraft, like mandrake and belladonna, and they're really initiators. They kind of cause the difficult experiences that we grow from. And then you talked about the trees, the kind of high priestesses of the plant world, of the trees. They hold the most records, they hold the stories, they hold the teachings, and their job is to connect heaven to earth, just like humanity's job is to, stand upright and connect heaven to earth. But they can be great teachers for us, and when we become priests and priestesses, they're great peers and mentors for us.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like so this is already released.
Yep, and it just came out. It should be, if your stores don't have it, feel free to ask them to order it, but it's available online and through Amazon and my website. I actually put out a CD that goes along with it that guides you through some of it, and that CD is only available through my website. Other stores should have it, so it's been out for a little bit, a few weeks now, and hopefully you'll see it soon.
Very, very cool. I'm pretty sure that Tommy and Richard will be carrying it. And Angel Heart Gifts.
Very good for me.
Yeah.
For people who are not familiar, there's a shop that I come and teach down in Tampa and in that area.
Yeah, I've known them for years. I used to be one of the readers at Angel Heart Gifts years ago. But I guess the one of the cool things I want to talk about is the correlate. I'm a very much a studier of the Gnostic traditions and Buddhism, and I don't know why I correlate. When I go back to everything, I go there. But really, I think the most thing I've learned is that as I'm studying, I just follow my own I call it my higher self, and my higher self guides me to the right books, to the right chapter, or tells me the wisdom that I need to follow. And so I've never really held myself back from anything. And I don't know, how did you, have you experienced that throughout your studies? And
absolutely. I think there's that higher guidance. In the witchcraft traditions that I follow and kind of becoming a little bit more popular, and other ways to look at it is the idea of a 3-soul model. So that top soul or that third soul, we call the watcher, but you can call it the higher self, you can call it the bornless self, or the holy guardian angel. And I think the whole Western mystery traditions is about the core practice of it is really trying to invoke that higher self and to live by that higher self and merge with it. And the more that you do, the more it guides you to the right place, the right time, to say the right thing, to do the right thing. And the less of a sense it is separate from you, and the more of it, it's really one of the great lines from a ritual known as the Bornless Ritual from Aleister Crowley. It says, "You are myself made perfect, the likes of which the world has never seen." And it's really our job to make it be more seen and to really embody it more.
Yeah.
So I think being kind of that follower of the perennial wisdom and the timeless traditions, I don't shy away wisdom from any tradition.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer. One of the books I wrote was The Mystic Foundation, and the last section of it was all about different cultures and different religions and different spiritual systems, and trying to point out what was the same about them, what was different about them, and how each one can inform another.
Yeah.
And you got to find the little points that speak to you and speak to your spiritual path and evolution. But I think wisdom is wisdom wherever you find it. Like I have more of a connection to the East through the Hindu material, and the Tibetan lore that I like the most is actually the Tibetan Bon material, kind of the native indigenous practices, because they're very similar to witchcraft, but have their own slant on things. I've never gravitated as much to the Buddhism, but different people find things that connect with them. And I have students that are very Buddhist, and they'll say, oh, when you said this is very much like, and they compare it to some Buddhist teaching. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know that, but that just really teaches you that so much of the core practices of every religion can be compared to the core practices of everything else.
Yeah. We're wrapping up this segment, and we will be right back. Thank you for listening to Soul Talk. And welcome back. We're coming up here in our last couple segments, and we have Christopher Penczak here on the line, having a very great conversation. I just totally lost my train of thought. What were we talking about?
Trees.
Trees. We're talking about connecting with nature and connecting with the animals and really using them as our teachers. And there's just of course, definitely buy this book and get the benefit from it. But Christopher was giving us a good explanation of it. Christopher, where are you going next? I know you mentioned when we were talking on email, you said you were booked out until December, and pretty busy.
Yeah, I'm a little bit. I have to look at my schedule to know exactly where I am at the moment. I'm taking some time off right now this month. I was originally pushing the Plant Familiar book, but there's some family illness going on in my family, so I've been staying home to be supportive for everybody for that. And on a personal fun note, hopefully everything will be settled enough that I can do a little time down in New Orleans for a little vacation is what I plan next.
Oh, my favorite place.
One of my favorite places, and I feel a very strong spiritual connection there, even though I'm not necessarily a voodoo practitioner. But my husband is, so he likes going down there. But I think for teaching, I'm going to be in Michigan, speaking at the Michigan Pagan Fest in May. That's the big one that I can think of that's coming up in terms of festivals. And then I've got a lot of little events all throughout New England. I'm teaching a lot in Connecticut this year. I'm teaching this summer down in New Jersey. Going to be doing a plant magic event. I'm doing some stuff up in Vermont. So I'm kind of sticking in the New England area for a little bit of it. And I've got Indianapolis, probably the furthest away I'm going in the next month. By the end of April, I'll be down in Indianapolis teaching. Wow. So that should be fun, too. I just came back from South Carolina, so a little bit here, there, and everywhere. I'm trying to get a new Florida tour booked. That'll probably be in 2012. I'll be coming back out to Angel Heart and a few other places, I hope. And I'm trying to do something in California as well. I'm probably going to be speaking out in California next year at PentheaCon, which is a big festival there that I've missed for the last few years. So I'm hoping to get back this year and maybe do a little California tour.
Yeah, I get their emails on Facebook. The PentheaCon.
Yeah, it's a great event. It's overwhelming sometimes, but it's a great event. It's probably the biggest indoor pagan event that I know of right now.
And you were in Australia last year, weren't you?
I was. I was in Australia last January. It was an interesting trip.
I bet it was.
It didn't quite go the way I planned it, but it was an interesting trip.
I was a part of starting a spiritual center last year, and I emailed you, and you mentioned I'm Australian, I'm not coming to Florida for a while.
Yeah. So usually I try to go to Florida and California in the January, February, March time, because being a New Englander, we try to go someplace warm, although I hear you weren't that much warmer than us.
No.
You guys had a bad winter this year, but comparatively, I think it would have been a little easier for me. But, I was in Australia for last year, and so it was my first time speaking down there, and I spoke for a couple groups down there, although in the midst we had a little mishap where some of my events got canceled, so I had some time off for a little vacation in Australia, which is kind of neat.
Well, there you go. The goddess blessed you.
Exactly. Just you need some time off. Here you go. Enjoy some warm weather in January,
I actually, it's funny because I had to speak, I was hesitant to speak at the Florida Pagan Gathering, and I was asked to speak there. And I was like, well, I speak a lot of Gnostic Christianity. And so my friend Mama Gina, or Gina Estevez, and Medea from Florida Pagan Gathering said, if you don't get in here and speak, I'm going to hurt you. and they basically told me, because you study all religions and you cross-correlate them, well, why don't you come here and talk? And I talked about Ascensionism. And so it was probably the greatest experiences. And then I did a 2-hour workshop, and I partied the rest of the weekend. So
it's a great event. FPG is one of my favorite festivals to go to. I wish I could get down to it more often, but I really like to rotate out the speakers and not have all the same folks come down every year. But it's a really great event. The people there are fabulous, really well-educated group. I've never, even when I've done things that have not been strictly witchcraft or paganism, like I think I did a pretty popular Ascension Magic thing down there, and it went very well. So it doesn't surprise me that they received you well. They seem to very, very open, very educated about stuff. But it's also a really fun party too. I have a really great time dancing around the fire there.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite part. And I took my co-host this last year, and the funniest part about it is that him and I aren't great rustic people. So we had our tent and we had our cabin, and we didn't put our tent up very well. Medea came over. She goes, "Honey, you put this up wrong," and we were both laughing that a girl had put had helped us put up for our. I was like, "We're gay men. What do you expect?"
I used to refuse to camp, and for most parts, when I speak up for a festival, there's an option for cabins. I rather have the cabin, but there's a gay men's event that is in Ohio every September, and they had no option of cabins. It was pretty much just a tent-only place. It was right when Gay Witchcraft came out, and at first I thought, oh wow, this is going to be crazy. I don't really know if I want to do this, but I'm being called, so I feel like I should do it. I got the time open in my schedule. And it turned out to be one of the most amazing experiences, and now for the guy who doesn't camp, I go back every year and camp, and I promoted it so much, they gave me a job on the town council to do PR, public relations for them, so it's called Between the Worlds, if anybody thinks they'd be interested in it. It happens every September, but it's, the advertisement line I give for it is it gives the guy that doesn't want to camp an excuse to camp, so if I can camp and do it, then it must be good.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing at the FPG, telling everybody it's fun, you gotta go. And if you like nightclubs, you're going to love the Fire Circle. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Although it has such a welcoming vibe compared to a nightclub, that's one of the things I like about it. It's a very art-centric community.
Yeah, very, very true. One of the things that I'm finding is very interesting is that as I've been a teacher, of course, sometimes as a teacher we have to hold our students accountable, but we have to do it in a way to where they learn from it. And, of course, sometimes you get a lot of opposition. And, of course, anytime you have any level of success, there's people out there that want to not exactly be nice to you. And how have you dealt with that throughout the years?
I can't say it's easy. I think, that's definitely been one of my challenges. Is that, in astrology, I have an astrologer who talks about how having Cancer rising is, difficult because, people's public perception of you, is really a sensitive spot for you, and I think that's very true, at least in my experience. I have very clear, the students I take on, they're all, for the most part, public classes, but in those public classes that are the long-term apprenticeships and things like that, there's an application process, there's a clear syllabus. I try to make it very much like a contract. I think sometimes when you have student-teacher relationships, particularly as you get more friendly with the students, it's very good to show the human side and to not always be on. But at the same time, it's very good to have very clear boundaries of this is what I expect, this is what I don't expect. So having class policies, having a syllabus, having these are the assignments, these are the due dates, and you can be flexible in certain circumstances, but making sure everybody knows what is responsible, and what you're offering and what you're expecting, and vice versa, has been helpful. So the more professional I've kind of made the classes, the less informal, the more I feel like I can hold students accountable. I think in terms of success in the public aspect, I have a very good friend and author named Kala Trobe, and she's living out in England right now, and she's a witch and ceremonial magician. She wrote The Witch's Guide to Life, and we met very early in my career, and she dealt really well with criticism and book reviews, and when I was having a hard time with that, I was just talking to her about it, and she seemed so unfazed by it and very wise and unattached, and she's just like, well, darling, if you're saying something that everybody agrees with, what's the point? If you're saying something that's worthwhile, then of course it's going to rile up people, and of course people are going to disagree with it, or say this or that about you because you're pushing their buttons. As long as you do the best job that you can, and as long as it's well researched and very heart oriented, and you've done all that you feel that you need to get this information across, then you can't worry about how people take it because it didn't agree 100% with what they're saying.
Yeah.
And so I've always really taken that to heart, and that's something that's made the critical aspect, particularly in terms of writing and teaching, a lot easier to bear. Because I think if you are saying stuff that everybody agrees with, then you're not really saying anything new and furthering it. But if you're saying things that people are having difficulty with, or and even just success, when you're successful and people want to backbite or whatever, that sadly is a sign of success, and you just have to deal with it. Because some people rather talk about other people and talk about what they think you should be doing rather than doing what they need to do.
Right, and a lot of times I've found if people are getting upset, there's a level of truth to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would like to, be able to go out and, whatever you say and whatever you teach, people are like, wow, that was brilliant. I agree 100%. But I think if it's really, worth it, I think of the things that have been the most helpful to me have often been really oppositional. it was the process of integrating that was helpful. I studied with a Hindu teacher for quite a few years, and one of the basis of part of our teaching was the Bhagavad Gita, and I had a really hard time with the Bhagavad Gita. Here's this world text, it's this classic, and it's really accepted and understood from so many different points of view, and as a witch, I really had a hard time with the way it was presented and the way that the
Okay, and we're back, and thank you for listening to Soul Talk. And
Christopher, we're just going to wrap up this segment.
The last segment I had to
cut you off,
cut off Christopher
and then
in
we'll
mid-thought,
be right
so
back. I just wanted him to complete his thought, and so...
Well, I was just saying that, that oppositional nature, I had a really hard time with the Bhagavad Gita with one of my teachers. It was really only in sitting with it and discussing it and seeing how it applied to my life that I could really integrate it. But I think when I first read it, I didn't really see the spiritual value in it, or I didn't understand why it was such a classic. And I probably wouldn't have given it a great review if it was a new book coming out or something like that. So I think always kind of keeping in comparison some of the things that have been the most helpful for me were things that I necessarily didn't agree with at first.
Right.
Aleister Crowley has been a huge influence on my writing and my worldview. But when I first read him, I thought he was crazy and didn't really understand it, didn't really understand what the big deal was, and disagreed with a lot of it because he really wrote in this very purple prose, veiled kind of language. Until I was really educated enough to know what he was really saying, it was kind of difficult.
I found a lot of spiritual texts are written in parables, which you already know, and it's sometimes it's very hard to understand it until.
Absolutely. And sometimes keeping in mind of what was that time period, what was that culture,
right.
What were they saying and doing at that time, and how does that relate to us now? Because it can be a classic, but it's a classic written in a different time for different people. How do you fit your mind around it now?
Right. I'm actually reading a book by the Yogananda, Awakening the Christ Consciousness Within You. The second coming of Christ.
Yogananda's The Autobiography of a Yogi was actually the teacher who taught me the Bhagavad Gita. That was her wedding gift to me, and that kind of got me on this whole, comparative to some of the Eastern stuff. And so Yogananda's really good in my book.
And it was pretty incredible. And the way we were talking about our higher self guiding us earlier, and how I came about that is I finally stopped judging anything and just looked at it and said, well, if my higher self says I should go, I'm going to go. And so I actually my cousin called me up and asked me to go to see this Christian televangelist. And I was like, I don't want to go. And I'd made a commitment to myself and I was like, I sat and I meditated. And I said, well, I'm going to go. So I went, and what I ended up doing is spending a time with my cousin and really connecting with her. But later on that day, we walked into Borders, and all I heard was, go to the spiritual books, go to the spiritual books. And I walked up, and the very first book that I saw was that book. And I just grabbed it off the two-book set, really. And I pulled it off, and the first thing I opened up to was about the bringing of consciousness into your body, and really awakening to that consciousness and letting this spirit work with you. And I know you were talking about the three bodies earlier, and so I thought that was really interesting. And so it was just one of those things where you're very spiritually led, and that's why I asked that question about have you ever followed your higher self, and really been just followed the spirit within you, I guess. And so,
I had a teacher who described it almost like breadcrumbs on the trail, and the higher self kind of leads you more and more until you get closer and closer. And I think that's been very true. Like one piece, I never knew where I was going, but one piece led to the next, very, very clearly in retrospect. But at the time, it seemed like it was a puzzle to be solved, or breadcrumbs on the trail. So yeah, absolutely.
And now I don't know if you're at this point in your life where I'm just so excited about the next bread piece, but also very excited about living in the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm at that point where I'm really trying to listen to transition, because all the transitions in my life have been somewhat spectacular and traumatic. So, I really put out the intention that the next transition I want to be very clear and very aware and listening to spirit and have it be as easy and graceful and gentle as possible. And I think that's been a lot of my work with the temple. We started up a nonprofit Temple of Witchcraft where I'm teaching mostly now and trying to build more of a physical center for community and community gatherings. And I feel like my career has really, and my spiritual teachings and practices and personal practices kind of transitioned out of what I used to be doing, traveling so much, and now trying to kind of set down roots and kind of build community and build something solid. And I think in years past, I think my job would have been spectacularly disappeared under some crisis and have to do this. and so now I'm trying to transition easily into it. Kind of always waiting for that next message of, okay, what's the next piece of the plan? What do I need to do? How do I need to do it? It can be frustrating to not know, what the end goal is, but to know that I've always been taken care of before, so it'll be taken care of this time.
Yeah. I think that's one of the key challenges for people in their path is that they get caught up in their safety needs or security needs and whether they're going to be taken care of or what's the next step, and their ego wants to grab onto it. And one of the things I don't know where I picked this up from. Ego stands for edging God out or edging goddess out, you're missing the higher aspects, but you have to live in the higher aspects of also your physical life too.
Yep,
so,
absolutely.
How did can you talk about some of your challenges maybe over your path, over the however many years?
Well, that's a big question. So for me in the healing path, it's been most interesting. The biggest challenge is probably anger. And in dealing with anger in an appropriate manner and realizing that to be angry doesn't necessarily mean that you're not spiritual.
Right.
I think, in fact, the suppression of anger is less spiritual than the expression of anger if it's appropriate.
Right.
And once I started dealing a lot with that on a conscious level, and then I started taking clients myself and doing healing, I noticed for the first 2 years of my healing practice, almost all of my clients, their underlying issue is some type of anger, some type of rage. So it was a great mirror to really check in constantly of where am I with this issue, and how am I coming back to it.
Yeah.
But it is interesting for me because I think there's such a thing as divine anger and this sense of divine justice, and sometimes anger spurs us to do what's necessary. But I think when you're really personal about it, you're kind of missing the point of it.
Yeah, you're not experiencing. You're in the reaction.
Right. I think there's a difference between a reaction and taking action.
Yeah.
When you take action, you decided this is what's going on. When you react, you're very unconscious about it.
Yeah.
So, trying to distinguish between reaction and response has been a huge thing for me. But definitely, very healing and something I'm able to pass on to other people, which has been helpful.
You said something really important there. You mentioned about, your healing practice, and one of the first things that my Usi Reiki master taught me was that in level, first attunement, heal thyself. And so as you're healing, I always know when I'm healing somebody else, I know that I'm healing myself at the same time.
Absolutely. And people will always mirror your stuff, so you're always going to be challenged to see things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I always find that very interesting when I got somebody sitting in front of me, and I'm literally I'm looking at myself in some aspect, and it's very, very, very interesting. Well, so you opened up the nonprofit, and it's actually a church, if I'm...
Yep, we're a religious religious organization. We refer to it as a temple, but legally it's a church.
Okay, very, very cool. And is it just going to be up in the New England area, or are you planning on expanding it out, or...?
Ideally, if we have the resources, I'd like to have centers, throughout the country and even the world. But at the moment, we're really trying to focus on a physical home base in New England, probably New Hampshire, because that's where we first incorporated. But anybody who's interested and wants to be involved, it's the templeofwitchcraft.org online, and we do correspondence online courses for the people. We've got members all across the country and even quite a few across the world. Most of our physical gatherings are in the New England area. We're going to try to do at least one festival a year, kind of like a tinier version of FPG in New Hampshire, and people who are coming out for their initiations can come out for that beforehand, and then we'll kind of all gather together and make it open to the public as well. But we're going to have some private parts for people who are members of the temple to stay over to do private initiation rituals, and I'm very excited about how it's shaping up. We do all the Wheel of the Year Sabbaths, we do all the moons. We're talking about doing kind of advanced for ministers, dark moon gathering support group for those who are actually doing the work out there, and it's shaping up really, really well.
Very, very cool. I'm excited for you.
Yeah, me too.
So just to kind of wrap up, I know you have the one book coming out. What other projects do you have going on that you'd want to talk about?
I've got lots of stuff going on. Right before the Plant Familiar book came out, our Copper Cauldron Publishing, our new publishing company, put out a book that's a little bit harder to find because it's very theologically complex, but it's called The Three Rays of Witchcraft. So that came out last year, and we're still kind of pushing that. So basically it's looking at the concepts in witchcraft of power and of love and of wisdom, and how the three are kind of braided together in our traditions. Coming out next month, I have another Llewellyn book coming out called The Witch's Heart, The Magic of Perfect Love and Perfect Trust. And it's a book on love magic, but it's not your typical love magic book because it's going to be much more about relationship and sustaining love and the things you need to do before you seek out love. But it'll also have love spells and love meditations and working with the gods and goddesses of love, but it even gets deeper into things like when relationship ends and divorce and fertility issues and marriages and pregnancy and that type of stuff. So it's pretty complex. I think it's kind of one of the deeper love magic books I've seen out there, so I'm very happy to be offering that. In the fall of next year, probably November, I've got a book called The Gates of Witchcraft coming out through Copper Cauldron, and that's going to be on trance. And then next year sometime, we haven't set a release date, I've got a grimoire on the Morgan, so the Celtic goddess Morgan and Anubis Maka, her three faces. I'm working on that. I also have kind of a crossover perennial wisdom book sometime next year in 2012.
Christopher, I'm just going to the end of the segment here, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. And we were just talking to Christopher about his latest projects and books that he's writing and other things that are going on. So I again had to end him in mid-thought. And so I'm just going to have him finish telling him about his latest projects.
Sure. I've got kind of perennial wisdom, looking at philosophies from several different traditions coming out next year too, and it's going to be a cross comparison, strangely, of Buddhism, Christianity, and paganism. That's kind of three major world traditions through the eyes of Buddha, Christ, and Merlin.
Nice.
The tentative title right now is Buddha, Christ, and Merlin, Three Wise Men for Our Time. So it's going to kind of show how each one has some similarities to it, but the emphasis is different in each one, and how to really relate those three to us. I'm very big into threes, as you can kind of tell.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about that. We don't have a release date for that, but those are the things that are done right now. I'm also editing and in charge of a couple anthologies that Copper Cauldron is going to put out, and those anthologies are actual pure fundraisers for the temple, so all money other than shipping and printing will go to the temple for our funds to gather up a physical space. One is on the ancestors, and it's going to look at different figures in modern witchcraft and that have crossed over, and what their teachings were, what their traditions were, ranging from Gerald Gardner and Victor Anderson, and maybe even some figures from history like Marie Laveau or Biddy Early, or those types of figures. I also have an anthology on rites of passage coming up soon, and it's going to be about Wiccanings and hand fastings and crossing over rituals. And then lastly, I've got one on plant spirits to kind of complement the plant spirit familiar. It's called The Green Lover, and it's different people's experiences with plants. So each article will be by a different person and their take on a particular plant.
Very, very cool. Now, you mentioned you're very much into threes. So paganism, Christianity, and Buddhism. Now, of course, one of the Buddhist lamas I met a while ago, and I mentioned to him that I've studied witchcraft and that kind of stuff, and he mentions to me, he said, well, Buddhism has witchcraft in it. And he was a Tibetan lama, and I said, really? And I sat down and talked to him for a while, and I've always felt that Christianity had witchcraft in it, and so in my studies, and of course, the modern day Christian wouldn't agree with me, but and he just went on. He says, yeah, in Tibet we have witches and medicine. They call them medicine witches, is the way he referred to it in his very broken English, and I just found that very incredible, and it went right along with my already belief that everything is magical and everything is a miracle.
I'm a big believer that witchcraft is really like a vocation.
Yeah.
I think every society, every tribe has had people that fill that function, whether you call them witches or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the religious expression of it can be different, because even in witchcraft today, there's different theologies. So it's not like witchcraft is one religion.
Yeah.
But I think being a witch is like a vocation. I sometimes even describe being a witch as almost like being gay. Either you are or you aren't, and you just kind of awaken to that fact and fulfill that role in life and that connection. And so I think it's really something inherent, but we can kind of apply religion to it in different ways if you look at it as a vocation.
Very exciting. Now, you mentioned threes. Now, is that, to me, 3 stands for the body, mind, and spirit, but I wasn't sure how you interpret that.
I think there's so many different threes. I mean, for me, I look at the 3 souls as the higher, the middle, and the lower.
Okay.
Part of the teachings of the 3 rays is there's a divine mind, a divine heart, and a divine will.
Right.
And through that comes out 3 rays or 3 forces, and this is kind of where my theosophy gets mixed in with my witchcraft in a syncretic sort of way. The idea that there's a ray of power and will, and that's the red ray. There's a ray of love and trust, which is the blue ray, and there's a ray of wisdom and cunning, which is the yellow or golden ray. Amen Re is really getting back to where did that come from, and a lot of occultist and Kabbalist studied it as well, and it fits into a lot of folklore with the oak, ash, and thorn, and the straight line, the bent line, the crooked line, and it all relates together. So I'm always trying to look at creatively where all these things are coming from.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And one of the things I gave out your website earlier, but is there other ways that people can contact you through an email, or I think
probably the best way is through the email through the website. So it's just info@ChristopherPenczak.com. I have a Facebook. There's an author page and a personal page. It's easier if you go like my author page because I'm running out of friend spaces on my personal page. And I pretty much answer all the email that I can through my author page. And also, if you're interested in the temple, check out templeofwitchcraft.org, and there's an info email there if you want more info to that. And you can email specific ministers in your area of interest.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And you were just listening to Christopher Penczak on Soul Talk. Thank you for listening, and I'll be right back. And we're back, and we just had Christopher Penczak on the line for an interview from the New England area. A very exciting interview, and just definitely a beautiful person, a very wise person, and we definitely learned a lot. As we'd stated before, you can definitely check out Christopher at ChristopherPenczak.com and check out his latest events and his tour dates, as well as all the other projects that are going on. I was very excited about having Christopher on the line, because even though I've only met him once and read only a couple of his books, I've considered him to be a teacher. And as you know, everybody is a teacher. Everything that we come across is a teacher. And his own book actually became very healing for me. And so it was at a time, like I said earlier on in the show, that I was writing my own book. And I read his book, and I realized that I had never met the man, but he wrote very much like a person that was speaking to me. And I felt like I was actually having a conversation with him. And that was very much how I wrote. And so it actually gave me the courage to finally open up. And I wrote my first book in 3 weeks. And so it was Spirit just really ran through me, and my soul just really lit up. And Christopher was actually the catalyst or the instrument to help me do that. He was the mirror that reflected back to me, that gave me to give myself permission to actually finally start doing what was bringing joy to me. And so I just find that so to be able to have this interview was very exciting for me. And most of my students in the area very, very much love Christopher Penczak. So it was an interesting story, because I met one of his students at the Florida Pagan Gathering, and her and I talked, and when I was starting the show, I emailed her on Facebook and said, "Hook a brother up." and she responded, she goes, "Let me email him and I'll find out." And then she emailed me about 3 hours later and said to contact him. And him and I have been shooting back and forth on emails for about a month, and finally narrowed it down today at the 11th of April, which is the day we're recording the show. So I hope you very much enjoyed the show. We have a lot of other cool people coming on the show. We have Patty Starr coming on in June, and many, many exciting people, many, many exciting musicians. And that's what Soul Talk is all about, is just getting in tune with yourself, understanding things, looking at the world as one, through love, compassion, and accepting all aspects of yourself. And when you can do that, just like Christopher has talked about on this show, you can really, really change your world and really, really have harmony. And here's a man that changed his entire belief system, but he followed his heart. And he followed his soul. And by doing that, he has changed his life. Built a huge friends base, built a ministry, built everything based on how he felt. And he stayed in tune with that. And so because of that, he has really changed his life. And so what he has become is a model for us to listen to ourselves, to give ourselves permission to listen to ourselves, and to live our lives and love ourselves, and love all aspects of ourselves, even in the greatest of opposition. And so that is a model, one that stands up and believes in themselves, even in Catholic school, when they were teaching you, and very angry because you wouldn't talk about the devil, and you wouldn't accept the devil, and you wanted to take personal responsibility. And I thought that was very profound when he started talking about we project out on the devil, but we use that as a catalyst to not take personal responsibility in our lives, that we make our own choices, we do our own things, and in the end, we're the creator of our own world. And so because of that, we never take ownership, and we never look at ourselves, and we get so wrapped up in our own pity and our victimism. But when you take ownership of your life, and you state, I'm the one that makes these choices, and I have free will, then you stop being the victim. And you start being the one that's living your life based on the experience you choose. And so that is the greatest gift you can give yourself, is to stand up and just be who you are and who you are in alignment with, and love yourself enough to be able to do it. And that doesn't matter if you're gay, straight, bisexual, Christian, Buddhist, pagan, transgendered. It does not matter. You make the choice for yourself to say that I'm an empowered being, and I'm going to live the life according to what makes me happy. And so Christopher had a path that taught him and his way. And now he's a shining example. And I have a way that is my way, that has brought peace to me. And whatever finds peace brings peace to you, and harmony in yourself, and acceptance of yourself. And you find that that's working for you, do it. Don't hold back. Don't let anybody put out your light. Don't let anybody put out the love you found in yourself. And so I want to thank you for listening to Soul Talk, and we'll have you listen next week.